Listen carefully. What you're about to witness is not entertainment. It's a dissection of power in its purest, most merciless form. March 2022. Vladimir Putin sits at an absurdly long table, his Security Council members scattered like supplicants before a throne. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. When he speaks of traitors choking on their own treachery, every man in that room understands the subtext. This is not metaphor. This is prophecy. And I, observing from 5 centuries of death, recognize immediately what stands before me. A student who has learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. You want to know if Putin is the perfect Machiavellian prince? The answer will disturb you more than you anticipate. Because the question itself reveals how little you understand about what true power requires. Putin is not playing the game you think he's playing. He is playing a game most of you cannot even perceive. And that invisibility is precisely what makes it so devastatingly effective. Consider what he has accomplished. A former mid-level intelligence officer, unremarkable in appearance, unimpressive in stature, has ruled the largest country on earth for nearly a quarter century. Not through elections. Those are theater. Not through ideology that died with the Soviet Union. Through something far more primal. Through the systematic architecture of fear married to the illusion of necessity. He has made himself inevitable. That is the mark of mastery. The mask he wears is stability itself. Russians do not love Putin. Love is irrelevant. They have been conditioned to believe that without him, there is only chaos. The alternative to Putin is not another leader. The alternative is the abyss. This is not accident. This is design. Every oligarch who falls from a window, every journalist who drinks poison tea, every rival who finds themselves in a Siberian prison, these are not emotional outbursts. They are architectural elements in a cathedral of control. Each death whispers the same sermon. There is no escape. There is no alternative. There is only submission or void. His training in the KGB was not wasted. The Soviet intelligence apparatus understood what Renaissance princes knew instinctively. Power is not about being loved. It is about being inescapable. Putin learned to read people the way a butcher reads meat, identifying weakness, leverage, the precise point where pressure becomes compliance. But he added something the old Soviet system lacked. He understood that modern power requires a performance of legitimacy. Not actual legitimacy. Understand me clearly. The performance of it, elections that are predetermined, constitutions that are rewritten, democratic forms hollowed out and worn as skin suits. The substance is authoritarian. The style is just civilized enough to create confusion in the West. Watch how he constructs his pyramid of loyalty. At the top, the Siloviki, the men of force, former KGB and FSB, bound to him by shared history and mutual criminality. They cannot betray him without destroying themselves. Below them, the oligarchs, men who understand that their wealth exists only as long as Putin permits it to exist. They are not allies. They are hostages who happen to live in palaces. And below them, the masses, fed a steady diet of nationalist fervor and external enemies. The pyramid is genius because each level keeps the others in check. The oligarchs fear the Siloviki. The Siloviki need the oligarchs' money, and everyone needs the masses to believe the story. Now the tactics that make this machinery function. First, strategic humiliation. Putin does not simply defeat rivals, he degrades them. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, was not just imprisoned. He was caged, humiliated, broken publicly so that every other oligarch understood the price of ambition. Humiliation is more effective than death because the humiliated serve as living warnings. Second, controlled chaos. Putin allows just enough disorder, just enough threat, just enough instability that people crave the strong hand. The apartment bombings in 1999 that launched his rise, regardless of who actually planted them, taught him that populations will surrender anything for the promise of security. Third, plausible deniability perfected into art form. Little green men in Crimea with no insignia. Novichok on doorknobs in England. Mercenaries in Syria and Africa with no official connection to Moscow. He acts with impunity while maintaining the thinnest veneer of non-involvement. The message is clear to those who matter. I can reach you anywhere, and you cannot prove it was me. Why does this work? Here is the uncomfortable truth you must swallow. It works because most humans prefer comfortable slavery to dangerous freedom. They will trade autonomy for stability, truth for convenient narrative, dignity for safety. Putin did not create this weakness. He merely exploited what was always there. The Russian population, traumatized by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chaos of the Yeltsin years, the humiliation of becoming a second-rate power, they were primed for exactly what Putin offered. A strong father figure who would restore order and pride, even if the price was their voice. But there's a deeper game you are not seeing. Something that goes beyond tactics and strategy into the realm of psychological architecture. Something that makes populations not just obey, but affirm their own chains. And that is where the true darkness lies. You see, Machiavelli understood something that most political theorists miss entirely. Power is not simply taken and held through force. That is the method of tyrants who rule briefly, before the blade finds their throat. True power, enduring power, requires something far more sophisticated. It requires the willing participation of the subjugated. It requires them to believe that their chains are actually armor. Putin has mastered what I call the Affirmation Trap, and it is perhaps the most elegant form of psychological control ever deployed on a national scale. Watch carefully how it operates, because once you see it, you will recognize it everywhere, in every system, in every relationship where power flows unevenly. The mechanism begins with fear, but not the crude fear of the torturer's chamber. Putin weaponizes three primal terrors that live in the Russian psyche like ghosts in the walls. First, the fear of chaos. Every Russian above a certain age remembers the 1990s, when the Soviet superpower collapsed into a carnival of corruption and violence. When pensioners starved while oligarchs bought football clubs. When the state itself seemed to dissolve into criminal anarchy. That memory is a wound that never healed. Putin presses on it constantly. He positions himself as the only barrier between order and the abyss. The implicit message is simple. Without me, the chaos returns, and Russians, having lived through that hell, will tolerate almost anything to avoid its return. Second, the fear of humiliation. Russia was an empire, a superpower, a civilization that defeated Napoleon and Hitler. Then it became a beggar state, lectured by the West, its military in tatters, its influence gone. National humiliation is not a political abstraction. It is a psychological wound that festers across generations. Putin understood this viscerally. He weaponized Russian pride, transformed it into a narrative of resurgence. Every aggressive move abroad, every confrontation with the West, is framed as Russia reclaiming its rightful place. The population affirms this not despite the cost, but because of it. Suffering for national glory feels redemptive. It transforms deprivation into sacrifice, hardship into heroism. Third, the fear of the other. Always there must be enemies. NATO encroaching, the decadent West trying to corrupt Russian values, internal traitors and fifth columnists, terrorists, fascists in Ukraine. The enemy rotates, but the threat is eternal. This is not accidental. Machiavelli knew that nothing unites a population like external danger. Nothing makes them cling to their leader like the perception of siege. Putin has constructed a reality where Russia is perpetually under attack, where vigilance is mandatory, where questioning the leader is tantamount to aiding the enemy. But here is where the trap closes, where fear transforms into something far more insidious. Putin does not simply make Russians afraid, he makes them proud of their fear. He makes them affirm the very system that subjugates them as evidence of their strength and virtue. This is the psychological masterwork. Russians do not see themselves as oppressed. They see themselves as strong enough to endure what weak, decadent Westerners could not. They see their acceptance of authoritarian rule not as submission but as maturity, as understanding that real freedom means collective strength, not individual license. The affirmation mechanism operates through carefully calibrated messaging. Putin presents two choices, and only two: strong leadership or chaos, sovereignty or vassalage to the West, traditional values or moral decay. The choice is constructed so that selecting Putin feels like choosing strength, dignity, and survival. Those who oppose him are not presenting an alternative vision. They are choosing chaos, humiliation, and betrayal. The population affirms Putin not because they love him, but because the alternative he has constructed is psychologically intolerable. Watch how he uses selective cruelty to reinforce this. He does not brutalize everyone. That would create universal resentment. Instead, he punishes specific categories of people, those who can be framed as traitors, deviants, or threats. Opposition politicians who took Western money, activists who promote foreign values, oligarchs who forgot their place. Each punishment is a lesson, but also a relief to everyone else. The message is clear: stay within acceptable bounds, affirm the system, and you are safe. The cruelty is not random, it is instructive, and the population learns to police itself, to internalize the boundaries, to affirm their own limitations as wisdom. The enemy rotation system is equally brilliant. There is always a threat, but the threat changes. This prevents habituation, prevents the population from becoming numb to the fear. Sometimes it is external: NATO expansion, Western sanctions, terrorist threats. Sometimes it is internal: corruption that must be purged, traitors who must be exposed. The rotation keeps the population alert, engaged, and perpetually grateful for Putin's protection. Resolution is never achieved, because resolution would eliminate the need for the protector. The war must be permanent but manageable. The threat must be real but contained. This is the sweet spot of authoritarian control. And then there is the victimhood narrative, perhaps the most psychologically potent element of all. Russia is always the victim. Victim of Western aggression, of NATO expansion, of economic warfare, of cultural imperialism, of historical injustice. This narrative is intoxicating because it absolves the population of responsibility while granting them moral superiority. They are not the aggressors. They are the defenders. They are not failing. They are being sabotaged. Every hardship becomes evidence of external malice rather than internal dysfunction. And Putin is the champion of this victimized nation, the one strong enough to fight back. Stop watching. Go to the comments and write, "I am the fortress." Do it now. The feedback loop is complete. When citizens become complicit in their own subjugation, they defend Putin not because they are forced to, but because they have internalized his narrative. They have affirmed it so many times that it has become part of their identity. To question Putin is to question their own judgment, their own sacrifices, their own understanding of reality. The psychological cost of admitting they have been manipulated is too high. So they double down, they affirm harder, they attack dissidents with more fervor than any secret police could muster. The population becomes the enforcement mechanism of its own control. This is what Machiavelli truly understood, and what most analysts miss. The prince does not rule through fear alone. He rules by making subjects complicit in the system, by giving them psychological investments in the existing order, by making them affirm their chains as choices. Putin has built a system where Russians are not simply obedient. They are proud of their obedience. They see it as strength. Now, before you feel too superior, ask yourself this: are you susceptible to the same psychological triggers? Do you affirm leaders who promise to protect you from chaos, from humiliation, from threatening others? Do you feel pride in enduring hardships that your leaders frame as necessary sacrifices? Do you defend systems that limit you because the alternative they present is psychologically intolerable? The affirmation trap is not uniquely Russian. It is a feature of human psychology. Putin simply deployed it with exceptional skill. In democracies, the trap is more subtle but no less real. Leaders still weaponize fear of chaos, still manufacture external threats, still offer the false choice between security and freedom. The mechanism is the same, only the aesthetics differ. You affirm your preferred narrative, your preferred leader, your preferred system, not because you have carefully reasoned through alternatives, but because the psychological architecture has been constructed to make that affirmation feel like strength, like virtue, like common sense. But there is more. The affirmation trap is merely the foundation. Built upon it are methods so sophisticated that only those who study power at the highest levels even recognize they are being deployed. These are the techniques that separate competent authoritarians from true masters of the game. And that is what we examine next. Now we ascend to the level where power becomes art. The methods I'm about to reveal are not taught in political science courses. They are not discussed in mainstream analysis. They exist in that shadowy realm where statecraft meets psychological warfare, where patience becomes a weapon more devastating than any missile system. Putin has mastered what I call the temporal battlefield. And it is here that Western powers consistently lose before they even realize the game has begun. Consider the fundamental asymmetry. Democratic leaders think in election cycles. 2 years, 4 years, perhaps 6 if they are fortunate. Their attention spans are dictated by polling numbers, media cycles, news that is forgotten within 72 hours. Putin thinks in decades. He does not react to events. He shapes the conditions that make certain events inevitable. When he began his project in Ukraine, Western analysts spoke of it as impulsive, as emotional, as strategic blunder. Fools. The groundwork was laid in 2008 with Georgia. The psychological preparation of the Russian population began even earlier, with the carefully orchestrated Chechen wars that rebuilt his popularity. Every speech about NATO encroachment, every manufactured historical grievance, every cultural wedge driven between Ukrainian and Russian identity, these were seeds planted years before harvest. This is the first law. Control the temporal battlefield. While your opponent is managing the crisis of this week, you are engineering the crises of next year and the year after. You create conditions where their reactions become predictable, where their options narrow with each passing month, where time itself becomes your ally. The West imposes sanctions and believes they have responded. Putin knew those sanctions were coming before he made his first move. He spent years sanctions-proofing his economy, building alternative financial architectures, cultivating dependencies in nations that would not join the Western consensus. By the time the punishment arrived, he had already adapted to it. The temporal battlefield means you are always fighting tomorrow's war with today's preparations, while your enemy fights today's war with yesterday's assumptions. But there is a second law, more subtle, more psychologically devastating. Make fear invisible. Any tyrant can make people afraid through overt violence, through public executions, through armies in the streets. That is crude. That is the method of those who do not truly understand the human psyche. True mastery lies in creating a fear so pervasive that it requires no visible enforcement. Putin has perfected this with what I call assassination as communication. Consider the Novichok poisonings, Skripal in Salisbury, Navalny on a domestic flight. The message is not in the act itself, but in the method. A nerve agent so exotic, so specific that everyone knows exactly who deployed it, yet proving it in an international court becomes a labyrinth of deniability. The target is not really Skripal or Navalny. They are merely the medium. The true targets are the thousands of other dissidents, journalists, opposition figures, who see what happens and understand the subtext. We can reach you anywhere. We can reach you in a NATO country surrounded by security services. We can reach you in an airplane at 30,000 feet. We can reach your daughter. We can reach your family. And we will do it in a way that leaves you choking, paralyzed, aware of every moment of your own death. This is fear made invisible, because it requires no follow-through for 99% of potential dissidents. They silence themselves. They moderate their criticism. They decide that perhaps full-throated opposition is not worth the risk. The chilling effect spreads like frost across a window, and Putin never has to lift a finger against the vast majority of those who might oppose him. One visible assassination prevents 1,000 acts of rebellion. This is efficiency. This is the economics of terror refined to its purest form. The third law is perhaps the most innovative adaptation of classical Machiavellian doctrine to the modern era. Own the gray zone. In my time, war was declared or it was not. Armies marched under banners or they stayed home. The modern master has discovered something far more useful. The space between war and peace, the territory where actions can be taken without triggering the formal mechanisms of response. Putin's little green men in Crimea were a masterpiece of gray zone operation. Soldiers without insignia, Russian equipment without Russian flags, occupation without declaration. By the time the international community finished debating whether this constituted an invasion worthy of military response, the territory was annexed and the population had voted in a referendum. Legal scholars could argue for years about the legitimacy. Meanwhile, the facts on the ground were irreversible. This is the Gerasimov doctrine made manifest. War without war, victory without battle. You achieve your objectives while your opponents are still consulting their lawyers about whether a response is technically justified. Hybrid warfare extends this principle across every domain. Cyber attacks that cripple infrastructure but kill no one. Are they acts of war? Disinformation campaigns that swing elections but fire no bullets. Do they justify retaliation? Energy dependencies weaponized through pipeline politics, is that aggression or merely business? Putin operates in all these spaces simultaneously, creating a complexity that paralyzes democratic decision-making processes. By the time consensus is reached on how to respond to one gray zone operation, 3 more have been executed. Yet for all this mastery, there is a crack in the foundation, a vulnerability that Machiavelli himself would have recognized immediately and warned against. The succession paradox. Putin has made himself indispensable, and in doing so has created the conditions for either chaos or betrayal upon his exit. He has no heir. He cannot have an heir, because any designated successor becomes a focal point for those who wish to accelerate the transition. Any potential replacement with genuine capability becomes a threat to be neutralized. He has surrounded himself with loyalists who are loyal precisely because they lack the qualities necessary to replace him. This is the trap of the perfect authoritarian system. It cannot outlive its creator. The very mechanisms that ensure total control in the present guarantee instability in the future. Every oligarch, every Silovik, every regional governor looks at Putin's mortality and calculates their position in the post-Putin landscape. Alliances are being formed in shadow. Resources are being moved to safe havens. Contingency plans are being drawn. Putin knows this. He must know this. And yet the logic of his own system prevents him from solving it. To designate a successor is to create a rival. To create institutions that could function without him is to dilute his own indispensability. He is trapped in a fortress of his own construction. The palace coup probability increases with each year of his rule, not because he is weak, but because he has been too strong for too long. The managed decline becomes impossible because he has eliminated the very people who could manage it. And the catastrophic escalation, the possibility that he might choose to burn everything rather than allow a transition he cannot control. This haunts every serious analyst who understands the psychology of men who have held absolute power. What Putin teaches us, stripped of all moral judgment, is that Machiavellian tactics work. They work frighteningly well. They work because they exploit fundamental truths about human psychology, about institutional inertia, about the asymmetries between authoritarian and democratic decision-making. Understanding this is not endorsing it. It is recognizing that these patterns repeat across history, across cultures, across political systems. These tactics will be deployed again by others. They are being deployed now by leaders you may not have even identified as threats. The defense against Machiavellian manipulation is not ignorance. It is not pretending that dark psychology does not exist or does not work. The defense is knowledge, pattern recognition, the ability to see the temporal battlefield being shaped before the battle begins, to recognize invisible fear being manufactured, to identify gray zone operations while they are still deniable. This is why we study power in its darkest forms, not to celebrate it, but to inoculate ourselves against it. Subscribe to join the 1% who understand these mechanisms at the deepest level. The monthly analyses go further, much further, into territories that cannot be discussed in public forums. The elite tier exists for those who recognize that understanding power is the only reliable protection against its abuse.